Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to start a discussion, and I want you to encourage not only to ask the questions, but also to share your opinions, comments, and so on. Oh, I see the first volunteer.
Thank you. Well, as probably the only student in the room that was a product of American Soviet studies that has been the subject today, and as particular as a student of Riasanovsky, Nicholas Riasanovsky and Martin Malia in Berkeley, I think I have to say something, and I really want to express my gratitude for what's been an extraordinarily fascinating panel, I think, very well coordinated papers, and I've learned a huge amount and been very stimulated. I have two comments and then a question. The first one is, and it's from the panel, but it's from this conference in general, and in a sense, in the experience of 2022, and then going back to the experience of 1991. And I think it might be very useful, at least it would be for me, to try to problematize this concept of сохранение единства России, rather than looking at it in this myriad of particular instances going across centuries that we're looking at it today, but rather maybe taking a methodological suggestion from Reinhold Koselleck and Begriffsgeschichte. And we treat the concept as a concept, this proposition of the сохранение, the preservation, the retaining of Russian territorial unity, and simply start to categorize and analyze different varieties, different explanations, different justifications of this in some kind of more comprehensive framework. And just listening to the papers this morning, Alexander's in particular, but all of them, really, you can identify at least 5, it seems to me, different sources of this idea that kind of end up geopolitically at the same place, but getting there in a different way. You have the cadets to begin with, this liberal nationalism. I don't think you used the term гражданственность, but that was very much part of this as well, this idea of equal citizenship across the empire. Then you have Eurasianism, which is directly connected, different from liberal nationalism, but very directly connected to liberal nationalism. Savitsky was the student of Struve, and that's very important, and one can see, but of course now arguing for unity on a cultural and civilizational basis, something rather different. You have the Bolsheviks in the 1920s, not Lenin, who said, no, 1916 was it, where he said self-determination is a good thing. They changed their mind after they won the Civil War, and of course they were now arguing for unity and struggling for unity, but of course on the basis of a kind of internationalism, a Marxist kind of proletarian peasant internationalism. You have the emigres, which we have heard about today also, to some extent sharing those ideas, but really in a category by themselves. And then finally, and most fascinatingly for me, and why I'm making this comment to begin with, this is the point about George Kennan and how George Kennan also supported. But George Kennan is not worried about liberal nationalism, I don't think. He's not worried about Marxist internationalism. He's not worried about code. He's coming from a realpolitik. He's coming from a great power, a theory of great powers, which really owes more to Bismarck, I think, and to that type of realpolitik thinking. I would say Bismarck, not Karpovich. You brought up Kennan in the Karpovich connection. I would say Bismarck in that thinking might be more to the point. So you have a variety of different sort of understandings, but all in a sense supporting the same thing. In the Cold War, it would have been very difficult to ask this question because the country was unified and there was a sort of an imminence to unity of Russia or Soviet that was there that you wouldn't necessarily question. And of course, it had a political significance in world politics. That's not with us anymore today. And now we can look backwards and ask this question, it seems to me, about it in this way. So that's comment number 1. Comment number 2, much shorter. And this is really directed toward Alexander, who again, I had a long talk with yesterday. It was very fascinating work you're doing. But I wonder if you're not underestimating, I'm just interested in your thoughts on this. You're underestimating the opposition of the American Cold War political establishment to the Soviet Union. Unless I misunderstood you, you seem to be saying that there was a lot of support there. It's an extremely interesting question, and all you're doing is raising it, because it's true that American or Western, I shouldn't generalize, American Soviet studies never really did much with nationalities. That was always a kind of a forgotten and a very minor, I remember this when I was a student, but with perestroika, and when the nationalities question emerged in Soviet politics, it immediately became an absolute central focus in North American Soviet studies, as if it was sort of an issue that was waiting to be posed, but gained immediate acceptance, and of course has become dominating then already in the late, my colleague and my friend Mark Beisinger, who you might know, the political scientist, he was always interested in Soviet government, was always writing about bureaucracies. And then all of a sudden he comes up with a book, I think it was on Soviet nationalities. When this became a question, immediately was taken over and was immediately understood, the principle of self-determination. So that's just a kind of a sort of a comment. But finally, and this is to the whole panel, my question, and this is just about détente. And you've given us very good information about the emigres, and that's really very interesting. But you're focusing on early periods. What happened in the 1970s and the 1980s? And you have people like Ulam and I think Richard Pipes, who were actually quite opposed to détente. And I think that was obvious from the material, but actually they played important roles politically. So that I think would be, filling in a little bit more about the later decades, perhaps, before leading up to Perestroika in 1991. But once again, I'd just like to finish complimenting the panel. It was really very stimulating. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. I guess we should collect the questions, comments, and opinions, and then we will give the opportunity and a chance for the speakers to answer.
I have one small question for Alexander. Vernadsky is an interesting figure. What I do not understand is this. He published a book called Kiev and Russia, which is a non sequitur, really. Now, given his background, given his understanding of Khrushchevsky and so on, why did he publish that sort of a book? There's no Kiev and Russia. Russia didn't exist at that time. So Russia and Russia are mixed up there. And this had a terribly bad impact on American studies of Russia, Ukraine, and so on.
Just to add a comment or reflection what Mark Besson told, with the discovering the nationalities in the Soviet reality within of the international scholarship, it was a huge difference, by the way, between the US and the West, and the Western Europe particularly, because all these studies, I guess with regard to the Caucasus, it started in the 50s, with Feruz Kazemzadeh with the first work. She was in the employee in the embassy, I guess, in Moscow of the US Embassy, of Iranian background, and works of Audrey Altstadt and of Ron Sune as well in the 60s and 70s on the Baku commune, and of many others. In Paris, there was a circle of the Russian emigres, Alexandra Benningsen and Kelkeuge, who started to combine somehow Caucasian issues with Russian history. But at least in Germany, it was maybe limited to the Baltic provinces of the former Russian Empire, where some solid books were emerged. But nothing comparable with regard to the Caucasian, and nothing to Central Asian history was delivered. And I was very, very surprised when Audrey Altstadt, I guess she's now about in end of 60s or start of the 70s, she said, wrote in one of the pre-words that it was important in Soviet studies in the US to study Russian language plus the language of a non-Russian nationality. In case of Tadeusz Świętochowski, it was Azeri, and in I guess Ron Sune covered all three Caucasian nationalities, somehow particularly Armenian. And he wrote also on Georgia, by the way. We had nothing comparable to that in Germany until maybe the February 2022, when all these debates started. Now, talking about the importance of non-Russian nationalities and so on and so on. That's why with this regard, maybe US experience was really as the lighthouse, something like that, or in the avant-garde, to put it in a Soviet vocabulary.
Okay, and maybe the last question, because due to the time limits.
Actually, it's a comment from Alexander. Very interesting fragment from Tutchev. What is and very interesting how it impacted even Stalin's understanding of, remember, I think in Tutchev you said that, from where, from Volga to Nile, which is kind of exaggerated, but if you remember, after the Second World War, Stalin pretended territory in Northern Africa, Tripoli area. I think it's a military base, so it's not so kind of exaggerated. So you see how this continuity of the Russian thinking goes to the Soviet, to Stalin understanding of the Soviet Union and the Russian idea. Let's say, put it in. Karpovich is very interesting, and actually it came to my mind that you can, if you want to publish, to develop this idea, I think it will be interesting to see in what way, Karpovich and Rezanovsky and others, and Moshe Lewin live in Lithuanian Jew, was also one of the main at the University of Pennsylvania, one of the main Russianist Sovietologists, whatever. It will be interesting how they were open to this non-Russian perspective of the Soviet Union, for instance, and being very critical of Russia. For instance, to what extent they recommended books like Судьба России or Смысле истоки русского коммунизма Бердяева, 1918-1937, which is very critical of Russia itself, yeah. Судьба России, saying about the Poles, the problem of the Russians, says Russian Berdyaev, not me, is a problem of recognition of the alterity, of the others. It's very difficult for them to understand, to recognize that somebody could be different from him. They want to transform others in Russians. They think they are, this ethnocentrism. Yes? Судьба России. And then the idea of Russian communism, also very interesting, religion. And I think that Alain Besançon, excellent book, Les origines intellectuelles du léninisme, it's a very great imitation and inspiration from Berdyev's Истокисmus, Rusko communism. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I believe the best solution is to give our panelists a possibility, opportunity to answer in the order as follow. The first one will be Dr. Ovramchik, the second one, Professor Kurolov, the third one, Dr. Dryblek, and the fourth one, Professor Łukasiewicz. So, Alexander.
Okay. I can use this. Thank you for all those very interesting questions. Well, it's difficult to address all of them, especially some comments. Thank you first to Professor Basin. Very interesting reflections on this, the concept of saving the unity of Russia. And I just want to say that I have to think more about this various layers of understanding and within Russian intellectual history and intellectual thought in the 20th century. And it is also a question, what is the unity of Russia and where does Russia begin and where does it end? So that's important issue, I think, for further research. As to this idea of George Kennan, or we may add here Henry Kissinger too, as a sort of saving Russian influence in Eastern Europe as a form of imposing realist perspective, or a sort of a form of realist thinking about Eurasia. And also your question about the American Cold War establishment and the Soviet Union. Do I underestimate the tensions? I mean, the aggressiveness of American Cold War establishment towards the Soviet Union. Well, I'm not sure that following 1956 or the death of Stalin in 1953, American Cold War establishment was somehow aggressively um, like took an aggressive stance against the Soviet Union. So the Soviet nationalities problem, even during the Gorbachev period, of course, was an issue. And you cited Beisinger. I can add Roman Shpurluk's works from the late 80s. Of course, Alexander Benningsen was even earlier, because but still he was quite present in America, and especially since that he in the 70s he cooperated with several American circles like Paul Hansa. Paul Hansa was Zbigniew Brzezinski's team at the Carter administration, and they tried to utilize Central Eurasian nationalism to undermine Soviet influences, especially during the war in Afghanistan. So basically, Benningsen's ideas influenced how some American circles, specifically those led by Zbigniew Brzezinski, saw the Soviet Union. But the main fact here is that never American establishment used the same lens or the same understanding of, let's say, Ukrainian national communism, Ukrainian Republic, as they did with regard to, let's say, Polish communism. So never Washington looked for Ukrainian Gomulka or Gomulka or Ukrainian national communists. So why didn't Americans predict the fall of the Soviet Union? Because they underestimated the force of national communism. People like Kravchuk, nobody believed that he can, at one point, basically go against Moscow. So once after following 1956, U.S. foreign policy, in my view at least, was rather encouraging evolution in satellite countries, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and others, but imposing status quo with regard to the Soviet Union proper. So no supporting for national communism in Ukraine or in Belarus or other countries. So in this regard, I think that American Cold War establishment was not specifically realistic, because at the end of the day, in the late 80s, it appeared that it is Ukrainian national communists who destroyed the Soviet Union, not Ukrainian national uprising or anti-communist uprising, no, just national communists. So I think in this regard, it was somehow a big naivety of American academia with regard to how the situation can develop in the Soviet Union. So as to detente, as far as I know, at least from my work in Zbigniew Brzezinski's archive, Brzezinski was significantly against, of course, detente, and also in terms of academic freedoms, for example, because the State Department, Kissinger, many other followers, advocates of detente, believe that we have to maintain relationships with other communist governments, be it in Poland, Soviet Union, other places, despite everything. If they bring opposition intellectuals into jails, it doesn't matter. Let's pursue our policy. Brzezinski was somehow different. So and one question was from Professor Kuromiya about Kiev and Russia. Indeed, Vernadsky's title of his work was Kiev and Russia, although he paid a lot of attention to Ukrainian history in his understanding of what was the history of Kiev and Russia. The problem is that back in the 60s and 70s, Kiev and Rus as a term was not elaborated. I mean, it was only in the 80s, I believe, with Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute established, with Omelian Pritsak's works, when he used this word Ukrainian Rus, and then in the 90s with Serhiy Plokhit's works, that American academic circles began to understand that Kievan Russia should be rather called Kievan Rus. Hrushevsky? It was published in 1941 for the first time, in English, yes. But still, it was a marginal, I mean, understanding of what was the old Kievan Commonwealth. So that's enough.
Thank you so much for all comments. And I would start with the last response of Alexander on Professor Kuromia question about George Vernadsky book and on Kiev and Russia. I just remind that you that George Vernadsky in his private talks and letters and often described and identified himself as a simultaneous Ukrainian and Russian. So he had both identities, and he was sure that it's something like exist, you know. And of course, in this respect, I refer to Begriffsgeschichte. I'm sure that currently in the concept of Kievan Rus or Kievan Russia should be a subject of the conceptual history, you know, when we are talking about scientific lexicon of, I would say, American scientific lexicon. And here is also concerning to the question of Professor Bazin. You know that, yeah, sure, I agree that this concept of Russia's territorial unity often appeared in this different context. But I have really huge problem with Russia history. And I'm sure that I am good in Russia history, but I have a huge problem. I cannot define the subtle side for Russian history, especially when we are talking about 20th century and the Soviet period, you know. I just remind here that Reinhard for the Western Europe defines this period from the 1750s till 1850s. For Ukraine, for Lithuania, for Belarus, I am sure it was a period from 1915, 1921. For Poland, it was a period of great immigration. But for the Russian history, I cannot define it, you know? And then after that, when I suppose when we define this period, we can put this concept in this, I would say, wider theoretical framework. And then we can define it more clearly. And I did not get any question, just my responding on comments. So thank you that you attended.
Thank you so much.
conference.
And now Dr. Driblak.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think that Russians are liberals and nationalists, socialists, Mensheviks, Catholics, Orthodox, but most of them are imperialists. Russia has tactics from Lenin to Putin. We observe tactic and using ideologies to cheating West and other countries. So I think that Russia hasn't got one ideology. Russia used many ideologies to build one big empire. Thank you.
Professor Łukasiewicz.
Oh, try only in a few words. First of all, this question about Ulam pipes in the 70s and 80s and later. Ulam retired 1992. And I would like to compare him with Pipes and Brzezinski because they were all immigrants at Harvard. Brzezinski then moved to Colombia, of course, and then to government. Nevertheless, they had similar formation of as the Sovietologies, yes, in the background, and then in education in American academia. And Brzezinski was a politician. Yes, he decided to switch into this direction, yes, to have influence on the events, yes, to practice something. Then you had Pipes, who was for a moment someone like politician in Reagan era, yes, at the beginning, yes, with this famous even Empire, which he denounced to be an author, and many such things. Nevertheless, I can tell you very shortly that in recollections of the officials from Department of State of those times, they ignored Pipes at all. As they had their own line how to treat Soviet Union, how to make American diplomacy toward this country, even though on the level of rhetoric, there was Reagan and Pipes. Yes, so these were different things, I think. And Ulam was totally out of this. He wanted to be in academia. He wanted to be a scholar. Of course, he was asked many times to go for some meetings, to advise in some things. Nevertheless, he was not so active in this field. But as the director of Russian Research Center, he was invited. He appeared in American politics very shortly in early 90s when he was invited by George Bush. So let's say he advised after the collapse of Soviet Union, yes, what happened, why this happened, and so on. And the problem is with our knowledge about this, yes, what can we learn from them today? Yes, we don't have Cold War like that. Russia is totally different. Yes, this is not Soviet Union with all the spheres of influence like then. But let's say so instruments changed. Nevertheless, I think that reading Ulam or Pipes or Brzezinski or some others, we can refer to very important concepts of geopolitics, practice of foreign policy, nationalities like this, and shortly on nationalities. I totally agree, yes, that let's say the invention of the thing is connected with Prometheism, British politics in the region, and many other. But when we are moving toward after war period, I can add more names, like Walter Kolarz, for example, about Russia and her colonies, or totally forgotten today. Yes, very, very important author. And Pipes, who was starting his studies in the middle of 50s, trying to interview some Promethean activists in Europe, traveling through this, doing this for MIT project, which aimed to dissolve Soviet Union like former Prometheus wanted. Yes, so this is very, very important. But as I said, in 80s, when Pipes advised this to the president, ignored this. Yes, so I think that we have different lines, and it is still a work for us as researchers to reconstruct this, yes, to see the picture, and I think for our contemporary thinking to learn something from those times. Thank you.
Okay, we're over time a little bit, but I'd like to thank you, first of all, our speakers for the deep and interesting presentation. I would like to thank for the all comments, very valuable comments, for the taking part in the discussion. And I'm like to close the morning part, the morning panel, and enjoy your coffee break.